Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this evening's show of BookBytes. Now, stories of migration, whether forced or coerced, often make for very interesting human stories. The human experience documented in these movements is both appealing, sometimes horrifying, and often gratifying. We have a new book by author Shevlyn Mottai called Across the Kala Pani, and stories of indenture have particular reference and fervor on our land, in our land in South Africa, and especially on the East Coast, in KwaZulu Natal, where we talk about the stories of indentured laborers who were coerced into coming through with this promise of this great promised land and what it had to offer. And the conditions were often more than not of the most of the greatest working conditions and circumstances. Author Shevlyn Mottai captures this so brilliantly in her new novel, looking at the lives of four women who board a ship in Madras to cross the Kala Pani, the Black Water, to Natal. From Lakshmi, a young widow, to Chinma, heavily pregnant, and Voti, who escapes, Voti, the Brahmin, who's from the Brahmin caste. We see so many different themes, and through these various figures. To give a little bit about Shevlyn Mottai, she works as a deputy head teacher and English teacher in a secondary school in England. Born in Pietermaritzburg, she descends from indentured Indians from Arcot in South India, her ancestors having arrived in Natal on the ship Umzinto in 1909. She has taken several courses in creative writing and has published poetry and short stories and competitions. Across the Kala Pani is her first novel. Shevlyn, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. We really want to sort of sink our teeth into this beautiful novel, and your journey taken through this. Take us through some of your journey writing and researching this novel.
Firstly, thank you so much. Thank you so much to you and to everybody in Book Bites, and who's been responsible for making sure I'm here and all the sound and all of that's working. So really appreciate that. It has been a bit of a whirlwind, but the response in South Africa has been amazing, and I just want to thank everybody for that. I think it also tells us that there's a hunger, a desire to know more about our Indian indenture and our ancestry, and perhaps that's more of a national theme. But I think on an international stage, if we look at the books that are being well read and being read and the really selling and winning prizes, it's about identity. And so I think it has themes that cross over all of those. So my journey, as you mentioned, I'm a deputy head teacher, so a full-time job there. But I teach English, and I've always had a love of languages and a love of books from the time I was a little girl. I grew up in Pietermaritzburg, and a local library was built while I was a young girl, and I devoured every single thing that they had in the library. But what was lacking was a sense of me reflected in those characters. Yes, I was adventurous like the famous five, and I was a bit of a daydreamer like the characters in Enid Blyton stories. But what I couldn't identify in terms of people who ate the food I ate, people who looked like me in the illustrations. And so it was always stories of places far away, people very different to myself. And I guess that's where it all began, a desire to know more about who I was, where I was from. And I heard stories as a little girl about my great great grandfather arriving on a ship called the Umzinto. Well, luckily, one of my aunts had a ship number, indenture number, and the name of my great great grandfather, Sapani Mottai. And where that led me, when I became an adult and I was looking into identity, especially since I myself immigrated to the UK in 2002, I started inquiring more about it. So it has taken perhaps 10 years, and it's finally culminated in the novel that it is. It has been arduous because it involves so much of research. And what I then found was two things. I found that the research wasn't really accessible, even though I consider myself to be quite academic. There were complexities with the language and what was happening in it, and the documents, from the ship, the protector's documents or the captain's logs. So that was one thing, and then the other is I found that the voices of the women were missing. So when I started researching, I was looking to find out more about my great great grandfather. And then I found out that the woman he had arrived with on the ship was actually not his wife in India. and there was a 1-year-old baby who also was on that ship named Padvatel, who arrived in South Africa. And so my imagination then just took over, as well as the research I'd read, and it's become a composite really of all the women I came across in my research, and it's melded into this narrative.
I especially enjoyed following the journey and the development of your character in Lakshmi because each of your characters is layered, but there was something that really captured the imagination in more than one way. When you talk of piecing together these characters and relying on what was documented at the same time, what was it like to be able to choose how you would represent the women in this book?
Look, it was so important because I didn't want to present them as helpless. Yes, there was a lot of disadvantage, and they were certainly not, they were on the receiving end of a lot of cruelty and abuse, but they were also quite wily, and they were quite clever about things at times. And the alliances they formed with each other helped them to get things done. Like even, in the depot, the women would wash the clothes because the depot was the holding place for the women before they got put into the ships and for families. And the depot was well guarded because you'd be screened by the doctor, and you couldn't really leave the depot in case you got ill again. So you were kept there sometimes for months before a ship left. So there, the women formed alliances, and they looked after each other, helped each other with the children, and helped each other cook. And then on the ship, they talk about jahaji bais, shipmates, so to speak, and that's what continued. And then when the women arrived in South Africa, of course we realized that they pushed certain agendas, and they wanted schools later on, they wanted a little plot of land to garden. So all of that became really instrumental in carving these characters. I had the stories, they were real stories, I knew what the women had done. I just needed to meld it into a way that made sense and made it accessible to the reader.
We know there's a genre leap. We know that having facts and having reports can be somewhat one-dimensional. To
Mhm.
create those dialogues, to create those characters, and to form this contract with your reader to say this is as real as it gets, takes an extra leap. What was it like for you making that leap,
It was
getting into the
really,
skin?
really difficult because it did require a bit of skill. But luckily, I'm a reader. I'm a voracious reader, and so I think the best way to describe it for me is I breathed in all the research, and somehow when I breathed out, the story happened. And there were things that moved me to my very core. And as that continued, I felt like there was a responsibility placed on me. And I'll give you one example. So in one of the ship logs, the protector writes about the bad behavior of the schoolie woman because her baby had died, and he wanted to throw it into the furnace, the body, to get rid of this baby. But then there was a big commotion because the mother was so distraught, and she was, clutching onto the baby. And he eventually wrapped the baby up in cloth and he chucked the baby into the sea. And how they had to hold her back because she wanted to jump in after. And his account is very unsympathetic. His account is very cold, very distant, very one dimensional. But I felt, what about that woman? What about what she had felt? How it must feel to have to go through all of that, and then still face the prospect of moving to a new land and the challenges it faced. So absolutely crucial. And I write this in the acknowledgements. I just hope I've done them justice. And even if I've gone a small way to represent them and put them out there in the hands of readers so that they get a sense of what that was like, then I think I've done my job.
I think you've definitely built bridges of empathy and association, because when many of the stories are spoken about the elders and the grandparents who came across from India, you often hear stories of the conditions on those ships and losing a child, whether it's through dysentery or smallpox or whatever had disease had caught on at the time, and that not being having enough medical supply of food or whatever the case might be. It was often the children who bore the brunt of this harrowing journey. And I often think about, and you capture it so well, and I think that's what makes your book identifiable from so many different perspectives, is to capture that crossing over of the Kala Pani, that the unknown, really reaching across the unknown when you've been sold this great dream. from dire circumstances and taking that leap of faith to say, I'm taking my family, I'm leaving everything, and I'm just going. Not the way we sort of. I mean, you've come over from the UK now. It's an overnighter. You're fine. You're settled in. Those were very harrowing journeys, and they came to poor working conditions where they were dehumanized. It's important that you have document this, and I congratulate the way in which you've done it. Speak to
Thank
us
you.
about the personal aspect. I want to hear, you mentioned that this has family history linked to it. Speak to us about the personal aspect of writing this book.
Like I mentioned earlier, it started with a curiosity, wanting to know about the great great grandfather. And as I poured through the research, I started realizing also there was nothing much about my great grandmother. Um, that in itself tells you the story. There's not a lot of pictures. And to date, I don't have a picture of her, but we have a few of my great great grandfather. So it was quite personal in that all this time in 1909 when they made this trip, my great great grandmother was about 23, 24. She had this 1-year-old child, and I believe she died quite young. But nobody knows where she's even buried, and what circumstances she went through. I think there were a few children born in South Africa, from that union. But the little girl that came over with them passed away maybe last year before the book can actually be released, and I never had the chance to meet her, who was a relative. But what's fascinating is their journey, the lineage, my family line, in terms of where it went to. My grandfather was one of the sons, obviously, and then my mother, one of the daughters, and there's some of the spirit that still continued to live on in them. Now, in India at the time, when the Indians decided to indenture, there were a lot of push factors as well. India was a colony. There was a drought and famine. There was huge land taxes, which prevented people like my great great grandfather from making a living off the land, because you worked the land. He was from a pariah caste. He was an agricultural man, and so to eke out a living, and I had to fill in the gaps. Why would you leave? Knowing you would break caste by crossing the Kala Pani. What were their fears? And yes, the recruiters, the Arkatis, the Kanjanis, also as they're known as, they did a brilliant job of actually duping the Indians to some extent, but some went willingly. And I also point out in the book that some passengers were free Indians who came on their own accord and were free to come and go as they liked. I didn't just want to present the one dimension, of people being dehumanized, because that was happening, but other things were also happening around India and around South Africa at the time.
But those comparisons are made by the observers on the ship, and they do notice that they're being treated differently, that they've been treated poorly, and that need for dignity is not met in so many of the cases. And then bringing us across to, when they land in Durban. I mean, the treatment of people by the sort of establishment, so to
Mhm.
speak. People go missing, people get buried in the fields and are treated poorly with rations and punished so severely as well. You capture that extremely, extremely sort of vividly. This adds to the conversation about indenture, about the poor working conditions, about the treatment of people, about missing people along the
Mhm.
way, right? The undocumented, so to speak. What has the response been so far? I know it's a fresh, newly launched book,
Mhm.
but tell me about the feel and the response, the emotions that this evokes, especially on
People
our
have been
shores.
Yes, people have been really, really, touched and moved by it. And I think, I don't know if this applies to other writers, but I never quite imagined the reach this would have. I knew there was a story to tell. I knew that I needed to put it out there for my family, for myself, and in the hope that it would ignite some thinking, especially in our younger generation, about our own history. And this is not to take away a place from slavery. I understand that, and what a big, you know, uh, 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 horrific thing it was for thousands of people, if not millions. But this is also a story, and this is also part of history. And I think because I grew up in apartheid South Africa, I lacked that. I didn't have that. I knew all about, World War One and World War Two, and I knew all about Jan van Riebeck, and all of the things that we were taught, but I didn't know about my own identity. So the reception, I think there must be a lot of people who would think the same, because I keep meeting people who want to talk about where their research stopped, if only they could find out, or even just shocked and horrified at the treatment of women because they didn't quite understand that. The story was misty and hazy, and there was a lack of clarity around it. And now I hope that the story, at least, because every single thing that happens in the novel happened. I just put it together in a coherent format, if you like. And my job, I want to say, was easy. It wasn't easy, but the story was there. I melded into something I think is more accessible. But the reception has been overwhelming. And I tell you what I really value is when somebody comes to me and talks to me about the way it's affected them, the deep personal place. It does make me laugh when I think about this, because my husband read it. I didn't give him any versions of it. I only gave him the book when it finally arrived. The first copy was going to be his. And he read it in a few days. And he said, Shevlyn, I didn't realize your mind was so dark. But then he said, but I guess it had to be, because those women went through hell on earth. And that summed it up. I couldn't tell the story any other way, but it has been quite emotional. It has been quite hard, because I knew what I had to do at certain points. And everybody loves a happy ending. Everybody loves a happy story full of hope. But it couldn't be that, because that wouldn't be true to those women and what they endured.
Well, your existence and your next generation and the fact that you wrote this book are part of the happy ending. If you've reached into the past and tried to get the story of your grandparents. So, I
Mhm.
mean, I think that it takes a lot of courage to write memoir, so to speak, even if it has this historical novel basis to it, and you've been able to obviously situate it in the story of indenture in such a beautiful way. An emotional event to be able to put this together. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
And such a beautiful presentation for your family, for your children to be able to pick this up, for your nieces and nephews to pick this up and say, this is our family. This is
Yes.
our history. So I think that yes, a lot of us will find resonance in many aspects of the book. I enjoyed that you speak about sisterhood, and those are the themes that tie your the women in your story together, both the struggle and the triumph, and
Hmm.
the way that sisterhood and alliances actually help. I mean, the agency that they display, in some cases, often surprising and yet not.
Hmm.
I don't want to give away, how beautifully this turns out. So it's just that I have admiration for the triumph through difficulty, because there are extreme difficulties that each of the women in this book face. What do you anticipate globally for the receipt of this book? You spoke about this being, thematic about identity and global identity, in that filling in that sense. I think that this would have resonance in India as well. Um, Taking this back to where you teach, to the UK, what do you anticipate responses there, or hope for on that side of the world?
If I'm really honest with you, I'd love it. I'd love it to be featuring in shops in bookshops in the UK. I think that would be wonderful. But anywhere in the world, if because I read a lot of plantation literature, and I love Andrea Levy and Alice Walker, Lalita Tadimi, who wrote the Cane River. Recent one I read was Yellow Woman, a fantastic, beautiful accounts, and such strength in characters, beautifully crafted. I have such admiration. Um, but and if those books can reach an international audience, I see no reason why across the Kala Pani shouldn't, in terms of the themes. And when obviously, because I live in the UK and I've got friends and a massive South African population of friends as well there. But what strikes me is there's a thirst and a knowledge for people to understand. Even for myself, but you look Indian, Shevlin. You're South African. How does that work? But then you're also British. And identity can be quite fluid in that way. But people want to know more. And if ever there
Right.
was a good time around to talk about diversity, to talk about these themes that are coming up in the book, and for people to also have a bit of a window on the culture. We teach a unit in at GCSE level in the UK, and it's poems from other cultures. And it used to be, just snippets, poems from, as it says, poems from other cultures. And what it does is it engages the children. And the vast majority of the children I teach are white British children, but it engages them in a discussion. Suddenly we are in Jamaica market and we talk, Miss, what's a plantain? And then we look at that and we think about that. And sometimes, we bring up the fruit that I can find in the supermarkets and they taste it and we talk about the sensory experiences. So I'll use it a lot in my creative writing classes. But and what it does for those children, and I've seen it, it opens their minds to what else is out there, which I just think is a wonderful, wonderful thing to expose young people to.
Absolutely. I think that it is motivation and can form the basis for some very, very interesting discussions across the board. And I know that even locally in South Africa and across the continent, it's going to have great traction with readers and
So
add to the
much.
conversation. Many years ago, I remember a researcher by the name of Rihanna Ibrahim Veli wrote an anthropological account just called Kala Pani.
Mhm.
And she delved with the depth of the thematic consideration about what it meant to take that leap across to a new country. And you've managed to capture that in a fictional novel, the essence, while relaying such strong characters. Because as I say, I always find fiction is that next level, that next dimension compared
Mhm.
to, as a person of sociological training who writes in fiction, there is that leap, there is that dance across that one has to take to create those new dimensions, and make them really, tangible to your audience and to your readership. So congratulations again on that. And I really enjoyed this book. I know that it will be enjoyed across the board. And I've really enjoyed having a chance to chat to you about it as well. We wish you everything of the best with
Thank you.
your book tour over the next few weeks.
Thank you so much. It's certainly a bit of an eye opener. And I was saying to my sister today, I just wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a book, and knowing me, I got in on the deep end. I had all these ideas. I knew I had to have concurrent narratives. I knew I needed it to be picturesque and to capture the essence of Durban and the beauty that surrounds us in South Africa. And I needed to capture the racial tensions. I needed to capture the male female dynamics. There was so much I knew I needed to reflect this very, I want to say rich, but perhaps complex is the better word, a complex society. In India with the caste system, South Africa with segregation and the role of the planter and colonialism. But I also think that my own journey in terms of a physical one of leaving South Africa, of starting in a new country, and the challenges you face around your own identity and how you want to assimilate and belong. And again, there, perhaps that's what comes through is the sisterhood, the people who surrounded me personally, not necessarily women, but good men as well, who said, can we help you with this, or do you need a television, or can we give you this bicycle for your son? So it comes at you from many angles, but I think that is life, and that's what it means to be a human. There's all these facets to us as individuals. But for the women in the story,
Absolutely.
my only hope is that I've done them justice. And that when
Right.
people read this and they talk about it, they feel a connection with those women and the spirit that they represent.
I'm glad you said that because I think that writing stories of this nature, historical fiction, has a spiritual dimension without a doubt. And you do reach inside of yourself with your intention, not just to interrogate your own identity and where you come from, but to be able to give form to something, so steeped in the past and with so many layered sort of experiences and dimensions to it. And your readership will definitely be able to judge the outcome of the book. I always say once a book is written, it stops belonging in a way. I mean, it's your copyright certainly, but it kind of takes on ownership through its readership. So
I think you're
it'll
so
form
right
a
about
wave
that.
and carry that wave along with it.
That is so true. And when at a talk yesterday, the quotation came to my mind, and I link it to like being a mother. And I read somewhere, when you become a mother, you agree to let your heart go walking around outside your body. And it always stayed with me. And this book feels like that. I became a writer.
Right.
I put this out there. And when people buy a copy or talk to me about it, I'm almost nervous like, are you going to like it? Is it going to meet your expectation? Is it going to resonate with you? And the more feedback I'm getting, and even conversations like the one we're having now, just reaffirms that yes, it no longer belongs to me. It belongs in the hands of whoever has it, to make meaning of it, to connect with it, to feel, to question, to
Right.
ponder, to act even if there's an act that needs to follow, in terms of their own lives.
Absolutely. Thank you for a fantastic read, and I know that it's going to have a lot of conversation flowing over the next few weeks and months, and I wish you everything of the best with it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
And so that's it from us on Book Bites this evening. You heard from Shevlyn Mottai, the new author of Across the Kala Pani, which is currently being launched across KwaZulu-Natal and the country. Please look out for it and get hold of a copy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.